You feel it first before you know it's there. A weight in the air, a breath not your own, a silence so deep it hums. We've all heard the stories. A cold draft across the nape of the neck when no windows are open. A creak on the stairs when no one else is home. The feeling of being watched and turning to find nothing but shadows. Ghost stories are not rare. In fact, they are common, ubiquitous even from the bustling avenues of modern cities to the rice paddies of ancient Asia. From highland villages to towering cathedrals, humans, across time and place, have seen and spoken of ghosts. Pale figures at the foot of a bed, children crying in the wind, a woman in white, forever waiting by the sea. And yet, few ever pause to ask why? Why do humans almost instinctively believe in ghosts? This question is not only about belief in the supernatural. It's not about whether ghosts are real in a material sense. Instead, it asks something far more compelling. Why has the human mind, across cultures, across epochs, so consistently created ghosts? Why do we need them? Because make no mistake, belief in ghosts is not random. It is not illogical. It is archetypal, deeply rooted in the architecture of the psyche. There is something in our collective mind that calls forth the image of the unseen, the unspoken, the returning. Ghosts, in this sense, are not accidents of fear. They are expressions of memory. Let us look at this more closely. Ghosts across the world, the universality of haunting. From oral folklore to sacred texts, from whispered tales around firelight to best-selling novels, the ghost is one of the oldest recurring characters in human storytelling. More importantly, ghost stories are not limited to any one place. In Japan, for example, the yurei, ghosts of those who died with unresolved emotions, are seen as persistent and dangerous, especially if the person died suddenly, by suicide, or was denied a proper funeral. Yurei are mourned and respected. Families hold entire festivals, like Obon, to honor and appease them. The ghost here is a cultural constant, an expected companion to the grieving process. In West African spiritual systems, spirits of ancestors remain actively involved in the lives of the living. Ancestors are not gone, they have shifted. They speak through dreams. They warn through misfortunes. To forget them is to invite imbalance. A ghost is not something to be feared, but to be consulted. In Vietnam, the hungry ghost, or Ma Doi, represents more than the dead. It embodies injustice, those who died too young, without descendants, or in suffering. These ghosts are restless because they were forgotten. Hence, the 7th lunar month, known as the Ghost Month, becomes a time of ritual, of offering, of remembrance. The ghost is a cultural debt. In Ireland, the banshee keens before death, a cry that signifies not just loss, but destiny. And in Latin America, La Llorona, the weeping woman, haunts riverbanks, her cries echoing both guilt and punishment. She is both a warning and a mirror. How is it that cultures separated by oceans, by language, by theology, all speak of the same figure? The same cold presence in the night? The same need to name the invisible? Beyond fiction, the personal encounter. You don't have to believe in ghosts to feel like you've met one. A person grieving the loss of a parent might say they felt them watching, just once on the day of the funeral. A mother who miscarried might feel her child's presence near the crib she never got to use. A war veteran, waking from a half-sleep, might swear he saw his fallen friend sitting at the end of the bed. Not as a horror, but as a sorrow. These experiences don't only come from superstition. They come from longing. What, after all, is grief if not the mind's refusal to let go? A ghost is not just a spirit. It is a feeling that something is not finished, not fully buried, not truly gone. In this way, ghosts are not anomalies, they are expressions. They are how the mind externalizes what it cannot process internally. We give form to the unspeakable so we can speak of it. We give shape to the invisible so we don't feel insane. The ghost becomes our metaphor for pain. Morrison's Ghosts, the memory that refuses to die. The American writer Toni Morrison understood ghosts in this way, not as fantasy, but as the shape of memory. Her most iconic novel, Beloved, does not ask, are ghosts real? It asks, What happens when the past is not buried? In Beloved, a formerly enslaved woman is haunted, not just by a spectral figure, but by her own decisions, by the system that crushed her family, and by the child she lost. That ghost is not random. It is historical. It is psychological. It is cultural. Morrison once said, "If you're going to hold someone down, you're going to have to hold on to the other end of the chain. You're both in prison." In her worldview, the ghost was the unbroken link between trauma and memory. It was not there to scare us. It was there to remind us that something was left undone. Beloved is not a horror novel. It is a novel about what horror does to the human mind, and what happens when no one listens to the people who lived through it. A collective phenomenon. Think of war. Think of genocide. Think of the millions who die without funerals, without closure, without justice. How does a society process that? Not all at once. Instead, it begins to tell stories. Stories of the cursed battlefield, of haunted hospitals, of villages where babies cry at night but no one lives there. Stories emerge in places where collective trauma festers, because the psyche, like the body, rejects what cannot be digested. The ghost, then, is not just personal. It is communal, a symptom of something larger than the individual, a sign that society itself has unfinished business. Are ghosts real? That depends on your definition of real. If real means something with measurable weight, empirical evidence, or scientific repetition, perhaps not. But if real means repeated across time and culture, felt deeply and consistently, powerful enough to shape belief, behavior, art, and ritual, then yes, ghosts are real. They are cultural facts, even if not scientific ones. They are psychological realities, even if not physical ones. They are memories made visible, the question that haunts. So why do humans always see ghosts? Because we are not just creatures of the present. Because we carry too much history, too many names, too many regrets. Because there are things we cannot forget. And because forgetting them would mean losing part of ourselves. Ghosts remind us that we are not as finished as we think. That the story is not yet over. That somewhere, someone, or something is still waiting to be named. And so we see them, in the corner of the room, in the bend of a dream, in the silence after a door closes. Ghosts, in the end, are not only about death. They are about the living, and what the living have not yet learned to release. You may call it folklore or myth or superstition, but the ghosts we speak of are not visitors from the dead. They are letters from the past we never dared to read aloud. Long before modern physics, before psychology named our syndromes and disorders, long before the printing press spread ideas like wildfire, human beings told stories. Stories of strange sights in the night. Stories of footsteps in empty rooms. Of weeping near rivers. Of laughter from unlit stairwells. Stories of ghosts. And perhaps the most haunting thing is not the ghost itself, but how universal the ghost is. Across continents, religions, time periods, and empires, humans have imagined, and insisted upon, the presence of the dead among the living. This is not cultural coincidence. It is not mere entertainment. The ghost, as we begin to see, is functional. It belongs to culture. It tells us something essential about the society that created it. Let us begin by traveling across the globe. 1. East Asia memory in ritual form. In Japan, ghost stories are woven into the fabric of national consciousness. Here, the yurei ghosts of those who died in distress, particularly through betrayal, war, suicide, or murder, are more than campfire tales. They are emotional realities encoded into ritual. Yurei are typically depicted as pale, expressionless, and clothed in white, traditional funeral garments. Their long, unbound black hair symbolizes a loss of social order. And most importantly, they remain among the living because something has not been resolved. Revenge, grief, or abandonment. Japanese culture doesn't simply fear these ghosts, it hosts them. During Obon, an annual Buddhist festival, families light lanterns and clean ancestral graves to welcome the spirits of the departed. Far from exorcism, this is integration. The ghost is not cast away. It is invited home. It is recognized. And then, through rituals of fire and water, gently guided back to the spirit world. Ghosts here are not monsters. They are neglected truths. 2. Southeast Asia, hunger and justice. In Vietnamese folklore, the Ma Doi, hungry ghosts, are spirits of those who died without descendants, without proper burials, or in deep suffering. They wander, starved not for food alone, but for remembrance. The idea is spiritually precise. If your soul departs in pain and no one remembers you, you become a shadow, stuck between worlds. To be a hungry ghost is not just misfortune, it's injustice. Thus, the Vietnamese tradition holds the Thang Bay Am Lich, the ghost month, a time for offerings, incense, and paper goods to be burned. A bowl of rice, cup of tea, a folded paper house. Each item represents an apology from the living to the forgotten dead. The ghost is not just an individual, it is the manifestation of collective amnesia. It calls the living back to their duty, to remember, to grieve, to honor. 3. Africa, the ancestor who watches. In many African spiritual systems, particularly among the Yoruba, Akan, and Bantu peoples, the dead do not simply vanish. They remain, but not as ghosts in the Western horror sense. They exist as ancestors, active participants in the spiritual and moral order of the living. Rather than haunting out of malice, these spirits watch, advise, warn, and sometimes punish. A failure to honor them, through libation, dance, ritual, and spoken name, can cause illness, drought, or misfortune. Not out of evil, but because the chain of memory has been broken. Here, the ghost is not feared. It is relational. It is a moral force, an elder with expectations, a spirit that mirrors the values of kinship, duty, and continuity. This worldview doesn't see life and death as opposites, but as overlapping layers of the same river. And ghosts are the ripples that remind us something upstream has gone wrong. 4. Latin America, guilt, loss, and the weeping woman. In Latin American folklore, the ghost takes on another form entirely, La Llorona, the weeping woman. Versions differ across countries, but the core is similar. A woman drowns her children, whether in madness, despair, or betrayal, and, realizing her horror, dies and becomes a wandering spirit. She walks the rivers, eternally searching, crying for the children she lost. La Llorona is not merely a moral tale to frighten disobedient children. She is a cultural echo of loss, abandonment, and gendered grief. In societies shaped by colonization, patriarchy, and forced assimilation, the image of a mother haunted by her own action, punished for grief, resonates deeply. La Llorona is not just a ghost. She is a mother in mourning, a woman erased, a people colonized. Through her, we glimpse how folklore becomes a form of storytelling where shame and survival are braided into myth. 5. Western Europe, haunted by the past. Western Europe, particularly in its literary tradition, sees ghosts often in castles, manors, and warfields. The ghost in European culture is frequently tied to unjust death or moral corruption, especially that of the elite. Think of Shakespeare's Hamlet, where the ghost of the king calls his son to revenge. Or Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, where Marley's ghost drags chains forged by greed. In both cases, ghosts return not to haunt for horror's sake, but to demand correction. The ghost, then, functions as an ethical memory, one that refuses to be silenced. A reminder that the past does not stay buried just because we try to ignore it. And in post-World War Europe, the ghost shifts again. It becomes quieter, sadder. It no longer wails in towers but waits in photographs, lingers in ruins. It lives in absence, in names unspoken, in train stations that never led home again. Western ghosts, in this sense, are increasingly psychological. They are guilt in spectral form. 6. Indigenous and Native cosmologies, story as survival. Among many Native American and indigenous cultures, spirits and ancestral presences are not ghosts in the European sense. They are part of the world, integrated into nature, story, and ceremony. But that integration has been strained. After centuries of genocide, land theft, and cultural erasure, the stories change. The spirits are no longer only wise, they become restless. They mirror the historical wound. In contemporary indigenous literature, such as Leslie Marmon's Silko Ceremony, ghost-like beings often emerge as reminders of both heritage and trauma. They are messengers from the earth and from the past. Ghosts here ask not who died, but what was broken, and who still carries the silence. What unites them all? Across these traditions, we begin to see a pattern. Ghosts appear where rituals are broken. Ghosts speak when justice is denied. Ghosts linger when memory is suppressed. They are not necessarily evil. More often, they are urgent. Their presence is a form of pressure on the family, on the village, on the nation, to remember what has been buried. In this way, ghosts are less about the dead than about the living, and what the living have failed to do. Rituals of reconciliation. What cultures also show us is that ghosts are not invincible. They can be calmed. They can be laid to rest. But not through denial, through acknowledgement. The Japanese float lanterns downriver. The Vietnamese burn offerings at dusk. The Yoruba pour libations and say the names. The Irish hold wakes and tell stories. The Mexicans paint sugar skulls and light candles during Dia de los Muertos. These are not superstitions. They are technologies of grief, ways to metabolize loss. Ways to ensure the dead are not alone. Ways to say, we remember you, and we are still listening. Ghosts as the language of the unfinished. If you listen carefully, you'll hear it. The ghost is not always a scream. Sometimes it's a whisper, a name that still tastes like salt, a story your grandmother never finished telling. In every culture, in every century, ghosts speak a language the living try to avoid. You forgot. You lied. You buried it too soon. You survived, but you didn't heal. And so they return, not to terrify, but to testify. Conclusion. Culture remembers what history erases. The persistence of ghosts in culture is not proof that the dead walk among us. It is proof that we are still haunted by what we've left unsaid. Whether through a weeping mother, a cold hallway, or a paper lantern floating down a river, the ghost is culture's conscience. Its mirror, its wound, and sometimes, its only honest witness. We don't all see the same ghosts, but we all carry them, and they persist for as long as memory hurts more than forgetting. The ghosts we see may not walk beside us. They may walk within us. In the previous chapters, we explored how cultures across the world have interpreted ghosts, not as curiosities, but as necessary carriers of meaning. They appear when something has been forgotten, disrespected, or left unresolved. But what happens when we step away from the communal and look inward? What happens when the haunting doesn't come from the village, the battlefield, or the ancestors, but from inside the mind? To understand why humans see ghosts, not just hear about them, but see them, we must travel into the domains of psychology, neurobiology, and the deep structures of memory. What we discover there is not the end of belief in ghosts, but something far more haunting. We create ghosts because we cannot bear the silence. 1. The grieving mind, when loss refuses to let go. Let us begin with something deeply human, loss. Grief is not simply sadness. It is a rupture, an abrupt removal of presence. One moment, someone is there. Their voice, their footsteps, the scent of their coat, and then they are gone. The mind does not know what to do with absence, so it fills it. It substitutes. It improvises. In a 2011 study published in the Journal of Affective Disorders, researchers found that over 60% of widows and widowers report experiencing the presence of their deceased spouse, whether by hearing their voice, sensing their presence, or seeing brief apparitions. These experiences are not classified as hallucinations in a pathological sense. Psychologists refer to them instead as bereavement hallucinations, and far from being signs of mental illness, they're considered common, even healthy. The mind, in its effort to preserve continuity, reaches out and recreates the presence that anchored it. In this light, a ghost is not a supernatural event. It is the shape of the bond that remains, a connection too deep to sever simply because the body is gone. Toni Morrison echoed this in Beloved, where the ghost of the dead daughter returns not with vengeance, but with need, a hunger for acknowledgement, for explanation, for meaning. She writes, Not a house in the country ain't packed to its rafters with some dead Negro's grief. We lucky this ghost is a baby. Beloved, 1987. It's not just her grief. It's ours. And the ghost is what grief looks like when it refuses to be quiet. 2. Trauma and the body's memory of fear. Now let us consider trauma, a wound not only of the mind but of the nervous system itself. When a person experiences trauma, especially repeated or violent trauma, the brain shifts its wiring. The amygdala, the center for threat detection, becomes hyperactive. The hippocampus, responsible for placing events in context and time, becomes dysregulated. And the prefrontal cortex, which allows for rational thought and interpretation, can become weakened. The result is that the past no longer feels like the past. A war veteran, walking in a peaceful park, may suddenly hear an echo, smell a burnt scent, and be thrown back into the terror of combat. A trauma survivor may walk into a quiet room and feel danger pulsing in the walls. The trauma hasn't just affected memory, it has distorted time itself. In this fragile neurological landscape, the ghost becomes a kind of epistemic bridge, a form the brain creates to explain what cannot otherwise be contained. I feel like she's still here. I swear I saw him standing by the window. There was a shadow in my peripheral vision, and I just knew it was my brother. These statements aren't delusions. They are symptoms of a mind trying to re-narrate the unbearable. In many therapeutic frameworks, particularly those shaped by somatic psychology, the ghost becomes a metaphor for what the body remembers when the mind cannot speak. 3. Sleep paralysis and the edge of dream. There is another realm in which ghosts are frequently encountered. One that is ancient, misunderstood, and rooted in the bridge between wakefulness and sleep. It is called sleep paralysis. During REM sleep, your brain inhibits muscle activity to prevent you from acting out your dreams. But sometimes that inhibition lingers after you begin to wake. You find yourself awake but unable to move. You try to scream but no sound comes. Your chest feels heavy. And, most terrifying of all, many people report seeing a figure, dark, watching, pressing down on their body. Across cultures, this phenomenon is linked to the supernatural. In Japan, it's called kanashibari, a ghost holding one down. In Newfoundland, it's known as the old hag. In parts of Africa and the Caribbean, it's interpreted as witchcraft or possession. In Vietnam, it's known as bong da, literally shadow pressing down. But neurologically, it is the result of an unusual overlap. The dreaming brain remains active while the conscious brain begins to awaken. The figures seen are not figments of a haunted house, but residue from the dream realm, misinterpreted as reality. Yet, and this is important, just because something is neurologically explained does not strip it of meaning. The mind does not operate only in fact. It operates in symbol. The figure in sleep paralysis might be neurologically generated, yes, but it still reflects fear, repression, anxiety, vulnerability. It is a visual manifestation of helplessness. It is what it feels like to have a soul crying out in silence. 4. The uncanny and the psychology of perception. Sigmund Freud once described the uncanny, das Unheimliche, as the moment something familiar becomes disturbingly strange. A doll with two human eyes. A room that's empty but feels full. A photograph where someone seems to move. This phenomenon is deeply tied to the human tendency to seek pattern, meaning, and presence, even in absence. Psychologists call this pareidolia. The brain's habit of seeing faces in shadows, hearing voices in white noise, detecting motion in stillness. This is not foolishness. It is evolutionary survival. Early humans who heard a rustle and assumed wind might be eaten. Those who assumed predator and ran survived. So our brains are wired to assume agency, especially when our environment becomes ambiguous. Combine this with stress, grief, or cultural suggestion, and we create presence where there is none. The creak becomes a footstep. The flicker becomes a figure. But remember, perception is real to the perceiver. And what the brain sees, the body often believes. 5. Collective trauma and social hauntings. Not all ghosts are personal. Entire communities, nations, and generations can be haunted. This is what scholars call cultural trauma or collective haunting. Consider the Holocaust, the genocide in Rwanda, the transatlantic slave trade, residential schools for indigenous children. Even when survivors have died, the stories persist, not always through testimony, but through myth, nightmare, silence, atmosphere. In Beloved, Toni Morrison confronts the aftermath of American slavery not through statistics, but through a ghost. Not to terrify the reader, but because the reality of that historical wound requires a supernatural frame just to be bearable. This is not a story to pass on, she writes, and yet she passes it on, because the ghost, in her telling, is the only form that can carry a truth too brutal to face head-on. In this light, ghost stories aren't fiction, they're cultural metabolizers. The mind may forget a name, the archive may lose a record, but the ghost remains because it is made of what we didn't say out loud. 6. So, are we just hallucinating? Not exactly. We are narrative creatures. The brain is not a camera. It does not simply record and replay. It interprets, connects, translates. It assigns meaning. When the brain senses a pattern or the absence of one, it responds with a story. That story may involve a ghost. But that does not mean the person is delusional. It means the person is doing what humans do best, creating sense from disorder. In the therapeutic world, ghosts are sometimes understood not as hallucinations, but as symbols of transition. A widow sees her husband because her identity has shifted and the mind must reconcile that. A child sees a lost sibling because they are struggling to place death inside their mental map of reality. A community tells of haunted forests because the trees remember things the textbooks don't. These aren't just ghosts. They are cognitive artifacts of memory in motion. Conclusion: the mind as haunted house. To ask whether ghosts are real is perhaps to miss the point. The real question is, what are they trying to tell us? In the language of the psyche, a ghost is a memory not processed. A ghost is a grief not named. A ghost is a trauma that has outlived its wound. Psychology doesn't erase the ghost, it translates it. Neuroscience doesn't dismiss the vision, it reframes the question. We do not see ghosts because we are irrational. We see them because we are meaning-making machines. Because there are truths we cannot touch directly, and so the mind gives them form. In the end, a ghost is not a shadow in the hallway. It is the brain's most poetic way of saying, something still lives here. Something needs to be seen. Not everything buried is gone, and not every silence is peace. When we speak of ghosts in literature, we often speak of them as symbols, metaphors that echo through haunted mansions and unfinished lullabies. But for Toni Morrison, the ghost is something more precise, more urgent. It is history that refuses to die. It is memory in bodily form. It is the past, no longer content to remain unseen. Few writers in modern history have wielded the ghost with as much clarity and weight as Morrison. Her ghosts do not float aimlessly. They are pointed. They arrive with purpose. They demand confrontation, not belief. They are not anomalies, they are consequences. To understand Morrison's ghost is to understand what it means for a people, a family, a woman, a nation, to carry memory like a wound that never heals. 1. A haunting called Beloved. In her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Beloved, 1987, Morrison introduces us to Seeth, a formerly enslaved woman who has escaped to Ohio after enduring the unimaginable cruelties of plantation life. The story opens not with peace, but with disturbance. Her house is haunted. The ghost slams doors. It shakes furniture. It causes a baby's handprints to appear on glass. But unlike typical horror fiction, Morrison does not use the ghost to create fear for the reader. She uses it to explore what happens when trauma has nowhere to go. Seeth's haunting is not supernatural. It is psychic. The ghost is her daughter, a child she killed rather than allow to be taken back into slavery. A daughter she could not protect. A daughter she cannot forget. And so the child returns, not as memory, but as presence. 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. That is the opening line of the novel. And from that line forward, we understand that this will not be a story about escape, but about reckoning. The ghost in Beloved is not there to punish Seeth. It is there because what happened to her, and what she did in response, cannot be buried without consequence. 2. The function of the ghost, what Morrison teaches us. For Morrison, ghosts are not about death. They are about incomplete grieving. In her novels, the past is not distant. It is embodied. It walks, it sings, it weeps. It dresses in rags or white gowns. It waits outside windows. It knocks not because it wants to enter, but because it never left. Here's what makes Morrison's use of the ghost so revolutionary. The ghost is not fiction. It is the record of emotional truth. History books do not contain the sounds of crying children, the silence of a broken mother, or the heat of a whip. But Morrison's ghost does. Carries what facts cannot. It remembers what the archive erased. There is a loneliness that can be rocked. Arms crossed, knees drawn up, holding on. But there is a loneliness that roams. Beloved, the ghost roams because grief roams. Because slavery was not just physical oppression. It was the obliteration of identity, memory, and family. The ghost in Morrison's work is the soul's attempt to resist that erasure. B. The ghost is not a metaphor for guilt. It is the child of silence. In the novel, no one wants to talk about what Seethe did. Not even Seethe. But silence does not dissolve pain. It amplifies it. And so the ghost grows, first as a poltergeist, then as a living girl named Beloved. Beloved arrives with no history, no past, no future, just presence. And through her, Morrison forces the reader, and the characters, to confront everything they tried to forget. 3. Ghosts as historical reckoning. Morrison was not just writing fiction. She was rewriting cultural memory. She understood that America's official story of itself had omitted the voices of the enslaved, the exploited, the women, the children, the silenced. And so, she made them return as ghosts. Why? Because ghosts, unlike facts, cannot be ignored. They demand witness. They disrupt narrative. They enter the room, uninvited and undeniable. In an interview, Morrison once said, "If there's a book you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it." Beloved is that book. It writes the chapter that history left blank. Not by delivering statistics, but by placing the reader inside the haunted space where memory becomes too heavy to carry alone. The ghost, in this sense, is Morrison's form of protest. It says, "You will not forget what happened here. You will not turn away from what was done to me. I exist because you buried me too quickly." 4. Morrison and the politics of remembrance. In Morrison's hands, remembering is not sentimental. It is dangerous, because to truly remember means confronting injustice, confronting complicity, confronting pain that has no neat resolution. This is why, in Beloved, when the ghost girl takes form, she becomes obsessive, consuming, demanding. She needs to be fed, touched, loved. And eventually, she starts to take too much, from Seethe, from the house, from the future. What is Morrison saying? That if we do not metabolize our collective grief, it will consume us. That memory, when suppressed, does not vanish. It mutates, festers. It returns as something we no longer control. And isn't that, in essence, the deepest definition of a ghost? 5. Ghosts as psychological reclamation. Beyond historical trauma, Morrison uses the ghost to explore intergenerational pain. How mothers pass down not only love but fear, and how children inherit silence as a kind of legacy. In Beloved, Seethe's daughter Denver is born into a haunted house. She did nothing wrong, but she grows up with the atmosphere of the unsaid. She knows something terrible happened, but no one speaks of it. The ghost, for her, becomes the only one who is honest. In this way, Morrison speaks to a larger psychological truth. When families do not talk about pain, the pain doesn't disappear. It simply finds a new host. Morrison's ghost is the embodiment of what cannot be spoken. It is a way for the unspeakable to speak, through presence. 6. Ghosts as reparation, not just reminder. Importantly, Morrison does not use ghosts only to say, "Remember this." She uses them to ask, "What will you do now that you remember?" The ghost, once faced, offers something rare, the possibility of healing. But the price is high. It requires listening, accountability, forgiveness, community. In the final scenes of Beloved, Seethe begins to break, to collapse under the weight of the past. But then, the community of Black women surrounds her. They pray, they chant, they hold space. Together, they confront the ghost and slowly release her. This is Morrison's quiet revolution. Not that ghosts haunt us, but that we have the power to help them rest. 7. The ghost as an ethical force. In Beloved, the ghost has moral weight. It forces characters and readers to confront what justice means when there can be no undoing of harm. This is why Morrison's Ghost is so different from a Western horror trope. It is not entertainment. It is ethics in motion. The question she poses is not, is this real? It is, are you ready to carry what this memory asks of you? And that may be the most haunting question of all. 8. From Beloved to our world. We live in a world still haunted by slavery, by colonization, by genocide, by silence. There are countries where children were taken from their families and never returned. There are cities built over the graves of the exploited. There are systems that feed on forgetting. Morrison's Ghost is not just about 1873. It is about now. She gives us a lens to ask, who is being silenced? Whose story remains untold? What ghosts have we inherited not from belief but from history? Conclusion: Morrison's Ghost is us. In the end, Morrison doesn't ask us to believe in ghosts. She asks us to listen to them, because they are not strangers. They are our memory walking back into the room. They are the child we lost, the truth we buried, the ancestor we denied. They are the things we carry. And if we are brave enough, as Morrison was brave enough, we might stop running from them. We might sit down, listen, speak, and maybe, just maybe, set them free. Perhaps we do not see ghosts. Perhaps we see our own reflection, wearing the shape of something we've refused to face. After traveling through cultures, through psychology, through history and literature, the ghost still lingers. Not as an external entity but as a symbol, a sign, a message. To say a ghost is symbolic is not to say it is imaginary or unimportant. Quite the opposite. A symbol is the mind's most precise language for what has no name. It is the form we give to the unspeakable. A ghost, then, is not simply a scary figure from some past belief system. It is a living metaphor, sometimes for grief, sometimes for memory, sometimes for the self. But what exactly does the ghost symbolize? Why does the image of a translucent figure or a sudden chill or a whisper in the night speak so deeply to us, across language, across religion, across even reason? Let's walk through what the ghost has come to symbolize, not only in stories, but in us. 1. Ghosts as symbols of unresolved emotion. Let's begin with the most human interpretation. Emotion. A ghost can be a symbol of what we have not processed: grief, guilt, rage, love. When we lose someone, especially through violence or sudden death, the emotion becomes suspended. It has no closure, no ritual, no end. The ghost appears not as their continuation, but as the shape of our unfinished sorrow. In dreams, we often meet the dead, not to speak, but simply to stand beside them, to feel their presence again. These apparitions don't try to frighten us. They symbolize what we still carry, deep in the unconscious, where language cannot go. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, believed that ghosts in dreams and myth represent the shadow self, the part of us we deny. What if the ghost isn't someone else? What if the ghost is your own grief, wearing the face of someone you've lost? It is not they who haunt you. It is you refusing to let go or to speak or to forgive. 2. Ghosts as the return of repressed memory. A symbol, by nature, exists in two worlds, the conscious and the unconscious. Ghosts function in precisely this way. They appear in waking moments, but they are constructed in the deep vaults of memory. Trauma, especially childhood trauma, often fragments memory. There are things we do not remember not because they are gone, but because they are buried. But the psyche does not forget. The body does not forget. And so the mind begins to externalize, to create visions, to feel watched, to hear footsteps, to dream of someone you never met. The ghost here is a message from the buried self. It says, something is down here. Something is not healed. Come find me. The symbolic ghost asks us not to flee in fear, but to dig, to look, to remember. 3. Ghosts as symbols of moral injury and guilt. There is a kind of pain that goes beyond emotion. It is ethical pain, the kind we feel when we've done something that breaks our own moral code. This is common among soldiers, survivors, caretakers, and those who have made impossible choices. In psychology, this is called moral injury. It is the wound left by guilt, shame, or complicity. Think of Seethe in Beloved, who kills her daughter to save her from slavery. The ghost is not vengeance. It is moral reckoning. It is the body of a choice no one should have had to make. In ancient cultures, the ghost often appears when a murder has gone unpunished, not to punish, but to restore ethical order. In modern stories, the ghost appears when someone is consumed by guilt, whether justified or not. The ghost is the conscience made visible. It is what happens when we know, deep down, that something is not right, and no one else will say it. 4. Ghosts as symbols of invisibility and silence. Not all ghosts are dead. Some were never fully alive, not in the eyes of the world. Ghosts can symbolize those who have been ignored, erased, or dehumanized in life. These are the social ghosts. The poor, the abused, the missing, the unwanted. Toni Morrison reminds us that ghosts are the people who were never allowed to have a full story. They were background figures in someone else's history. They had no voice, no name, no monument. And so they return, not to say, I died, but to say, I existed. In this way, the ghost becomes a symbol of marginalization. It is the echo of a life that was never seen clearly, now demanding recognition. In political terms, this is why haunted spaces often reflect historical injustice. Plantations, boarding schools, internment camps. The ghost is not only spectral. It is sociological. It marks a wound the nation has not acknowledged. 5. Ghosts as symbols of broken time. The most curious thing about ghosts is how they disrupt chronology. A ghost appears not in the moment it died, but whenever it is remembered. This is a symbolic violation of time. Says, the past is not past. The moment is not over. What happened still echoes here. Ghosts are the symbolic antidote to historical amnesia. They do not allow linear healing. They re-enter the present. They interrupt. They say, this is not finished. In myth, they return at the stroke of midnight. In therapy, they return in a sudden panic attack. In dreams, they return just when you thought you had moved on. And all of them say the same thing. You're not done. You've just grown quiet. This broken time is why ghost stories often involve loops, repeating images, stuck patterns. The ghost is the psychological symbol of what refuses to pass, because it was never processed. 6. Ghosts as the unknown self. Perhaps the most profound symbolic interpretation of the ghost is that it is not someone else, but you. A version of you that was lost. A version of you that was denied. A version of you that never got to live. In Jungian psychology, this is the lost archetype, the potential self that never had space to develop. A boy who was not allowed to be gentle. A woman who was punished for ambition. A child whose voice was drowned by fear. The ghost, then, becomes the self we abandoned in order to survive. And it returns not to destroy us, but to reclaim us. It appears because there is something sacred within that has gone silent. When you hear a voice in the dark saying your name, what if it's your own voice, finally echoing back? 7. Ghosts as symbols of cultural reckoning. Zooming out once more, we see that the ghost can symbolize more than the personal. It can symbolize what a culture has failed to reckon with. Consider modern nations haunted by their own foundations. America. Slavery, displacement of indigenous people, lynchings. Germany, the Holocaust. Australia and Canada, residential schools and stolen generations. Vietnam. Generations shaped by war, silence, and loss. These histories are often officially closed, but emotionally unresolved. The ghost in these cases is not a superstition, it is a reminder. It says, "You built something here, but over what grave?" Artists, writers, and filmmakers often use ghosts in these contexts not to invoke fear, but to demand memory. To say, "This did not end. You just stopped looking." In this way, the ghost becomes the symbol of cultural responsibility, a presence that will not be exorcised by forgetting. 8. Ghosts as symbols of hope. Now we arrive at a paradox. For all their darkness, ghosts can also symbolize something else entirely. The possibility that the past can still be touched. When we dream of someone we loved, not in horror, but in peace, it can feel like visitation. When we light a candle, speak a name, or remember a story, the ghost becomes not threat but connection. The symbolic ghost is not always suffering. Sometimes, it is love with nowhere to go. It is longing. It is continuity. In this light, the ghost says, "You are still part of me. We are not done. There is more to say." Symbolically, this allows us to believe that healing is not about erasure. It is about relationship with what was lost. The ghost becomes the form through which that relationship endures, quietly, mysteriously, and sacredly. Conclusion. What are we really seeing? So, when we say we see a ghost, what are we really seeing? We may be seeing a grief we've hidden, a truth we've denied, a part of ourselves we've silenced, a pain our culture never made space for, a love that refuses to disappear. The ghost, then, is not just a symbol of fear. It is a symbol of continuity, of resistance, of meaning. It is what returns when something real has been forgotten. It is what lingers when silence has gone too long. It is what knocks, not to harm you, but to ask, "Will you finally open the door?" Ghosts are not things that chase us. They are things we carry, until we are ready to lay them down. We began this journey with a question. Why do humans always see ghosts? After hours of exploring, through ancient ritual, psychological fracture, cultural wound, literary metaphor, we find ourselves not with a simple answer, but with something more enduring, a truth, that we see ghosts because we are not yet whole, because history is not yet complete, because pain has not yet found its voice. And so the ghost comes not as horror, but as reminder. It stands at the edge of memory. It lingers in the corner of our perception. It waits in the silence after the closing of a door. Ghosts, in every culture and age, persist because forgetting is dangerous, because trauma unspoken becomes trauma repeated, because grief unprocessed becomes inheritance. And so this final chapter is not only a summary, it is an invitation to ask not only what we see when we see a ghost, but what we are refusing to face. 1. What we bury. We humans are brilliant at burial, not just of bodies but of truths, of names, of stories, of entire histories that threaten to unsettle the comfort we've constructed. We bury pain because it is inconvenient. We bury grief because it is messy. We bury memory because it threatens the myths we tell ourselves about who we are. But every buried thing casts a shadow, and sometimes that shadow gains form. It knocks, it walks, it whispers. We bury the child who was silenced, and she returns in dreams. We bury the war we never grieved, and it returns in generations shaped by silence. We bury the crimes of nations, and they return as haunted lands, wounded lineages, and stories we cannot tell without trembling. The ghost is what burial could not keep down. 2. What buries us? But what happens when we bury too much? We imagine that burial protects us, that if we hide it, it cannot hurt us. But the opposite is true. What we bury does not die. It compounds, contorts. It returns in other forms. Psychologically, repression becomes illness. Emotionally, silence becomes alienation. Culturally, denial becomes injustice. And personally, it becomes a haunting. We are not only haunted by what happened, we are haunted by our refusal to name what happened. And in time, this refusal begins to shape us. It buries us in shame, in disconnection, in the quiet terror of wondering, what else have I forgotten? To live without ghosts is not to escape death. It is to make peace with life. 3. Ghosts are what we inherit. In many indigenous and ancestral cultures, it is said that trauma does not end when the body dies. Continues, moving through blood, through gesture, through silence. This is now confirmed by science. Epigenetics has shown that trauma can alter gene expression across generations. The child of a war survivor may carry the physiological markers of stress, even if they were never in the war. In stories, we call this inheritance a curse. In science, we call it transgenerational trauma. But in the language of spirit, we might call it a ghost. Something unfinished in the past lives in the present. And until it is seen, spoken, and given a name, it remains. In this way, ghosts are not monsters. They are reminders of what must not be forgotten. For the danger of forgetting. The societies that suffer most are not the ones with ghosts. They are the ones that pretend not to have them. Where pain is denied, it grows. Where injustice is rewritten, it festers. Where the dead are silenced, the living grow hollow. Toni Morrison knew this intimately. She wrote, "This is not a story to pass on." But she did pass it on, because the worst stories are not the ones we remember. They are the ones we never tell. A nation that denies its past becomes its prisoner. A person who denies their wounds becomes their vessel. A family that buries its grief becomes its echo. In this sense, ghosts are not about the dead. They are about the living, and what the living are too afraid to face. 5. What the ghost asks of us. So what does the ghost ask? Not fear, not worship, not escape. The ghost asks, will you see me? Will you name what happened? Will you carry the memory, not as a chain, but as a bridge? Every culture that survives does so because it remembers wisely, not by clinging to the past, but by allowing the past to breathe, to speak, to move through ritual and song, through story and stone. In this way, we release our ghosts not by banishing them but by hearing them. To lay a ghost to rest, we must not deny it. We must honor it. 6. Rewriting the ending. Western horror trains us to destroy the ghost, to scream, to run, to fear. But Morrison and many ancestral traditions teach us another way. We do not fight the ghost. We feed it. We ask its name. We sit down with it. We listen. And slowly, not through force but through recognition, it quiets. The real exorcism is storytelling. The real protection is memory. The real healing is truth. So perhaps ghosts are not intruders. Perhaps they are our unacknowledged selves, standing in the doorway, waiting to be called in. 7. A new definition of ghost. Let us leave behind the cliché of sheets and chains. Let us define the ghost anew. A ghost is a memory with unfinished business, a story that demands a listener, a pain too dense for words, a mirror to what we buried in the dark, a sign that something once mattered deeply and still does. Seen in this light, ghosts are not anomalies. They are the most honest things in the room. 8. Final reflection. We are the haunted and the haunters. What if the ghost is not something external? What if you are the ghost in someone else's story? What if someone walks through a room you left and remembers a wound you never meant to give? We are all, in some sense, ghosts to each other, passing through, leaving traces, hoping to be remembered kindly, hoping to be laid to rest. So the work of ghost tending is also the work of compassion, of learning to live in such a way that we leave less haunting and more healing, that we become ancestors worth remembering, not just figures that return in silence. Closing lines and invitation. You have listened to many voices on this journey. The ghost of the child, the ghost of history, the ghost of the self, the ghost of the forgotten. Now ask yourself, what is the one ghost you still carry? Whose voice have you not yet listened to? What pain waits at the threshold of your memory? Don't run. Light a candle. Speak a name. Tell a story. Leave a cup of water on the table. Because what we bury in fear will always rise in longing. And only love, only truth, only courage can finally let it rest. It is not that the dead return. It is that we finally stayed still long enough to hear them.